For centuries, the image of Europe was shaped as that of a cultured and civilized continent, the cradle of art, science, and philosophy. But behind the stained glass windows of Gothic cathedrals, the red carpets of palaces, and the gilded columns of opera houses lay a floor soaked in African blood, and no one wanted to clean it up. The rapid growth of European powers between the 15th and 19th centuries was not solely the result of maritime discoveries, scientific revolutions, or political genius. It was driven by an invisible, cruel, and highly profitable engine: slavery. While kings and bankers wore silk and toasted with crystal glasses, millions of Africans were captured, branded like cattle, and shipped in overcrowded vessels to the Americas, all under the direct authorization of European nations. Portugal, a pioneer in this macabre trade, established fixed routes and coastal fortresses in regions like Angola, Guinea, and Mozambique. Spain quickly followed the same path. But it was with the entry of powers like England, France, and the Netherlands that the transatlantic slave trade reached an industrial scale. The system was refined, optimized, monetized. Slavery became a business, and Europe was the primary shareholder. Trading companies emerged as massive state-backed corporations like the Royal African Company, which negotiated directly with African kings and financed entire expeditions with military protection. The trade was not done in the shadows. It was encouraged, regulated, and protected by laws, taxes, and diplomatic agreements. It was an institutionalized business, legalized, designed by men in suits who never dirtied their hands but grew richer with every body that boarded. Each enslaved person represented a unit of profit, an investment, a cog in a ruthless machine. The triangular trade routes solidified the model. Weapons and textiles left Europe, were exchanged for human beings in Africa, and the enslaved were transported to the Americas, where they produced sugar, cotton, and tobacco, which returned to Europe in ships full of wealth. The cycle repeated, uninterrupted, and with every turn, Europe became richer. But while the numbers grew in the empire's treasuries, silence grew in the history books. The story was written with golden pens, but the inkwell was filled with pain. Because admitting the truth would mean looking in the mirror and seeing not a civilizing hero, but an accomplice to brutality. And that is precisely the stained image Europe chose to hide. But all it takes is to follow the trail of gold, diamonds, and sugar to find the origin. And that origin, as we will now see, hides within the palaces, cathedrals, and banks that still stand today on the ashes of millions of black lives. If you visit the great European capitals today, you'll find pristine avenues, imposing monuments, museums overflowing with artwork, and centuries-old universities. Everything seems to shine under the polish of progress. But behind every marble facade lies a buried truth that is rarely told. A significant part of this wealth was built with African blood. Lisbon, for instance, was for centuries the main slave port in Europe. Ships arrived there full of riches produced by enslaved hands in the colonies of Brazil and Africa. The gold from Minas Gerais, sugar from the Caribbean, cotton from plantations. All of it financed the construction of Baroque churches, royal palaces, and massive fortresses. And while church bells rang for Mass, on the other side of the ocean, whips tore into the flesh of those who upheld that luxury. In London, the names of prominent aristocratic families are directly tied to the slave trade. Many of them built commercial empires on slavery. They founded banks, maritime transport companies, insurance corporations. The profits came from the plantations, but the headquarters of these companies were right there, in Europe's most respected financial centers. The city of Bordeaux in France rose to commercial glory through the sugar and rum trade, products directly tied to forced labor in the colonies. Palaces, theaters, gardens, and bridges were funded with profits earned at the cost of human suffering. And the cruelest part? The enslaved were never seen as people. They were assets, property, human resources. Europe refined its language to disguise its brutality. Amsterdam, capital of the Netherlands, became a global financial center as early as the 17th century. Part of that growth came from the success of the West India companies, which, besides exploiting colonies, actively participated in the trafficking of Africans. The city that today prides itself on being a symbol of freedom and tolerance was, for a long time, a direct beneficiary and accomplice of the slave system. But it wasn't just money that Europe gained. It also gained prestige. The most renowned universities, such as Oxford, Cambridge, and the Sorbonne, received donations from families involved in the slave trade. Many of these institutions financed research, built libraries and buildings with money derived from the slave economy, and even today they display the coats of arms of families who grew rich in the shadows of pain. The truth is that African blood didn't just flow in tropical slave quarters, it also flowed through the marble columns of Europe. It was spilled to build cathedrals, fund scientific expeditions, create operas, theaters, and libraries. European culture was nourished by black bodies, but rarely did it honor them. And it is precisely in this contrast between architectural beauty and historical omission that Europe's silence becomes even more deafening, because while the world admires its works of art, almost no one asks, who paid for all this? But the answer exists. And in the next chapter, we will explore how this system of human trafficking was transformed into a legal, protected, and state-sponsored market, encouraged by the very crowns of Europe. After understanding how Europe turned blood into gold and suffering into palaces, it's time to dive even deeper into something even more disturbing: legality. Because contrary to what many believe, the trafficking of Africans was not an underground trade carried out in secrecy. Quite the opposite. It was regulated, authorized, and even incentivized by European states. It was a black market, legalized. It all began with a signature. Kings, queens, nobles, and European ministers issued licenses called asientos, or charters. Documents that authorized companies and private individuals to capture, transport, and sell human beings. These authorizations came with taxes, fees, and royalties for the royal treasury. It was a life-grinding machine with an official seal. The Royal African Company, for instance, received authorization from the British Crown to monopolize the slave trade for decades. Its ships left England carrying weapons, fabrics, and alcohol. They arrived on the African coasts and exchanged goods for people, often acquired through local wars instigated by Europeans themselves, and then sailed to the Americas. This was the so-called triangular trade, and it turned the Atlantic Ocean into a salty graveyard. And the numbers are staggering. It is estimated that more than 12 million Africans were transported as cargo. Of those, nearly 2 million died during the crossing alone. Not by accident, but by design. The ships were cramped, filthy, and lacked ventilation, because the tighter the ship, the greater the profit, and the faster the route, the less it mattered who survived. This monstrous system was so efficient that it created a new class of millionaires, slave merchants. They weren't nobles or warriors, they were businessmen. They calculated losses, profits, and human depreciation, and they used accounting books to record the birth of enslaved children as new assets. It was soulless capitalism, yet perfectly accepted in Enlightenment-era Europe. Meanwhile, churches often remained silent, and some even blessed the ships. They claimed that bringing Africans to Christianity justified the sacrifice, a twisted theology that soothed the European conscience. And so horror was justified with prayers, greed with doctrine, and torture with promises of salvation. This market also influenced the creation of insurance companies. It was possible to insure human cargo, and if the enslaved drowned or died in rebellions, the owners received compensation, as if they had lost ordinary goods. The human body had become a product, and dignity, a statistic. All of this happened with the full knowledge of the authorities. It was a visible, accepted, and protected trade. But when the lights of the 20th century came on, Europe erased that past. Pages were torn from the books. Ships were renamed, streets were rebranded, and former merchants of pain were turned into national heroes. But the scars remained, and to understand them, we must now turn to another sensitive point: the false idea that abolition marked the end of suffering. In the next chapter, we will see how Europe pretended to end slavery, but simply kept exploitation alive under new forms. When we think of abolition, we imagine chains being broken, crowds celebrating, and governments remorsefully acknowledging their wrongs. But in the case of Europe, that image is a carefully crafted illusion. The truth is bitter. Abolition was less an act of justice and more a political and economic strategy. Throughout the 19th century, as abolitionist movements gained momentum and international pressure mounted, European governments realized that officially maintaining slavery was no longer sustainable. But that didn't mean they were willing to give up their profits. So they created a new system. They removed the visible chains and kept the invisible ones. Instead of truly freeing the enslaved, many nations chose to compensate slave owners, one of the greatest ironies in history. In England, for example, the largest compensation package of the time was created. About £20 million were paid to slave owners. That's right. Those who exploited and got rich were rewarded, and those who suffered were left with scars and poverty. Not a single cent was given to the freed Africans. No land, no concrete rights, no reparations. Freedom came with hunger, exclusion, and abandonment. The system said, "You are free," but it didn't say how to survive, where to live, or how to work. It was freedom without a foundation. Even worse, in many colonies, the formerly enslaved were forced to continue working in the same fields, under the same sun, now under the name of contract labor or mandatory service. The words changed, but the oppression remained. It was the same old system, in a new disguise. Meanwhile, Europe celebrated its moral evolution. Statues were erected for leaders who freed the slaves, and conferences were held about civilization. But in the fine print of treaties and colonial agreements, they continued exploiting black and indigenous populations. Slavery, in truth, never ended. It merely changed its name. Neo-colonialism gained strength. Countries like France, England, and Belgium imposed new economic systems on African and Caribbean colonies, forcing local populations to produce for the metropolis at prices set by the colonizers, under exhausting work conditions. Those who disobeyed were punished, those who resisted were silenced, and the methods were the same: violence, coercion, humiliation. All of it legitimized by a narrative of a civilizing mission that portrayed the European as the savior and the colonized as a savage to be domesticated. European abolition was, in many ways, a performance, a political show meant to keep reputations clean in the eyes of the world, while their hands remained dirty. And the silence surrounding this truth still echoes in classrooms, in history books, and in national celebrations. But to understand how this exploitation deepened, even after the so-called liberation, we must look at a new scenario: post-abolition Africa. In the next chapter, we'll explore how Europe continued its plunder of African territories, now using flags, armies, and treaties. Europe had declared the end of slavery, but in practice, what it did was change the scenery, the methods, and the names. If African bodies were once chained and shipped to the Americas, now they were confined in their own lands. by fences, borders, armies, and laws crafted by foreign hands. The 19th century was marked by the so-called scramble for Africa. Between 1884 and 1885, European powers gathered at the Berlin Conference to divide the African continent like a chessboard. No African was invited. No tribal leader had a voice. Europe carved up the continent with maps, compasses, and greed. Each colony was administered as an extension of the empire, with one clear objective: extract everything and leave nothing behind. Belgium took the Congo, and there, under the rule of King Leopold II, millions of Africans were forced to extract rubber under a regime of terror. Hands were amputated as punishment for unmet quotas. Children were kidnapped as collateral for their parents' productivity. The system was so brutal that historians consider the Belgian Congo one of the greatest silent genocides of the modern world. In Algeria, France implemented a brutal occupation. It built railways, schools, and hospitals, but all designed to serve European settlers, not Algerians. Those who dared to question French rule were killed, tortured, or exiled. Local culture was repressed, African languages banned, and black identity, once again, was violently erased. England, for its part, expanded its empire to form the largest colonial network in history. With control over countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa, British rule imposed abusive taxes, confiscated lands, destroyed local economies, and promoted forced labor as state policy. The British Crown, even after officially abolishing slavery, still used the whip, just under a different name. The cruelest part: even after centuries of exploitation, the official narrative sold to the world was that of a civilizing mission. Europe cast itself as a bearer of progress, culture, and development, but in the villages, in the mines, in the extraction fields and makeshift prisons, the same scene of pain, submission, and violence found in the slave quarters of the New World was repeated. Africa was not liberated. It was invaded. And slavery did not end. It simply became domestic, institutional, colonized. Freedom became a mirage. The land became the property of foreigners, and the African people were once again treated as cogs in an empire fed by suffering. But why is this story not taught in European schools? Why are there so many monuments honoring colonizers and so few remembering the colonized? In the next chapter, we will understand the power of silence and how it was used as a weapon to erase centuries of pain and rewrite history in favor of those who ruled. After so many invasions, deaths, and lootings, the inevitable question arises: why has Europe never talked about this? Why was this part of history so deliberately silenced? The answer is simple and brutal: because telling the truth would mean shaking the very foundations of European pride. It would be like admitting that the splendor of empires was built on mountains of corpses. Since the 19th century, Europe has crafted a narrative that placed itself as a model of civilization, reason, and progress. This image was exported to the entire world, the European as educator, peacemaker, bringer of light. Acknowledging the central role of slavery and colonialism in that history would destroy the myth. And myths, when useful, are protected. That's why school curricula in countries like France, Belgium, and England mention slavery only in passing, if they mention it at all. In many cases, it is portrayed as a mistake of the past, a phase that was overcome, an unfortunate stain. But rarely is it shown as a profitable, well-planned system defended for centuries by laws, armies, and churches. European museums are filled with looted treasures, African art displayed out of context, indigenous artifacts taken by force. But few of those museums explain how these pieces got there. They don't say they were stolen during colonial wars or purchased with profits from slave plantations. Silence has become curation. Monuments celebrate explorers, navigators, empire builders. but they hide the stories of the exploited, the enslaved, the annihilated. Street names, public squares and universities still honor figures directly involved in human trafficking. The memory of violence was covered in noble titles. Moreover, Europe has always feared reparations. Telling the truth would mean taking responsibility, and taking responsibility could lead to demands for compensation, the return of artifacts, and historical justice. It would open a process that could threaten banks, institutions, family inheritances, and centuries-old reputations. So silence became policy, a strategy, a choice. Forgetting became a way to preserve comfort, and questioning the official story came to be seen as a threat. But truth doesn't disappear. It can be muffled, hidden, distorted, but it remains in forgotten names, in buried documents, in the faces of descendants, in the DNA of inequality. Europe chose to tell only the part of the story that suited it. But now, as more voices rise, that silence is beginning to crack. And when it is fully broken, we may finally see the real scale of what was done, not as an exception, but as the foundation of an entire system. In the next chapter, we'll explore how this historical omission shaped the world we live in today, and how the scars of slavery remain open in the bodies, the cities, and the social structures across the globe. European silence did not stay in the past, it shaped the present. Because when a story is only half told, the wounds do not heal. They deepen, multiply, and continue hurting in generations that officially never experienced slavery, but feel its effects every single day. Modern cities in Europe and the Americas are still divided by color and class. The poorest neighborhoods, with the least access to healthcare, education, and security, are predominantly black. Incarceration rates, unemployment, and police violence are disproportionately higher among the descendants of Africans. That is no coincidence. It is legacy. It is continuity. It is slavery disguised as social inequality. Black bodies continue to be seen as threats, as suspects, as disposable. The same logic that once turned men, women, and children into commodities still survives in the structures of institutional racism. Today, people are not sold in public markets, but profit is still made from their exclusion, from their marginalization, from their invisibility. And it's not just in the economy or politics, it's also in the imagination. For centuries, black people have been portrayed as inferior, lazy, dangerous, or exotic. This image was carefully crafted, repeated, and taught. And even today, it echoes through advertising, media, the entertainment industry, and school curricula. Black identity was stolen. African kings and queens were erased. Entire civilizations were erased. Intellectual, cultural, and spiritual contributions were erased. In their place, they placed chains, whips, and stereotypes. The self-esteem of a people was undermined from the cradle. And when history is taken away, the sense of belonging goes with it. But the cruelest part is that even after all of this, silence is still demanded. People still say, "That was in the past. It's over. Let's move on." As if it were possible to move forward without first looking back. As if inherited pain didn't live in the skin, in the surnames, in the absences, and in the trauma. The past is not buried. It pulses through the veins of the present. And unless it is faced with truth, justice, and remembrance, it will continue shaping a future that is unequal, racist, and unjust. In the next chapter, we'll conclude this journey. And one question will become inevitable. If Europe built so much upon pain, why does it still refuse to return the truth? The story you've heard up to this point is not told in classrooms. It does not appear on the golden plaques of museums, nor in the public tributes paid to the great names of Europe. Because this story is uncomfortable, it exposes, it topples statues, both physical and symbolic, and above all, it demands reparation. Modern Europe owes far more than it is willing to admit. Its castles, its universities, its banks, its international institutions, all were directly or indirectly funded by centuries of human trafficking, genocide, and colonial plunder. But admitting that would mean rethinking the foundations of its own identity. And few are willing to do that. That's why silence is so valuable. It protects inheritances, it protects fortunes, it protects narratives. While the world is moved by stories of resilience and freedom, it forgets that freedom was seized with bare hands by the victims, not granted by the oppressors. This is not just a matter of the past, it is a wound wide open in the present. And that's why many still fear this truth, because it disturbs, it exposes, it liberates. And for that very reason, it must be told. But now what? What do we do with this truth? How do we turn outrage into action? How do we stop this silence from continuing to decide who gets a voice, who has value, and who gets to have a story? That's what we'll talk about now. And if you've made it this far, it's because you too feel that this story must continue to be told. Now that you know the truth, the question is, what will you do with it? Will you keep it to yourself? Or will you help break this cycle of silence that protects the oppressors and erases the oppressed? The history of slavery, colonization, and racism doesn't belong only in books. It lives in our bodies, in our families, in our streets. And as long as it continues to be told by those who profited from others' suffering, it will remain incomplete. That's why your voice matters. Your indignation matters. Your memory matters. If this video stirred something in you, share it with others. Help this story reach the places school books don't, where the news stays silent, where monuments hide the truth. Leave a comment below and tell us what struck you the most. Your perspective could inspire other minds. And if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now. Here, we're not afraid to tell the truth. Every new video is an attempt to rebuild what was erased, distorted, or silenced, and you're part of that mission. Truth hurts, but it also sets us free. And together, we can ensure that the next generation learns history not through the eyes of those who conquered, but through the voices of those who resisted. Break the silence, share the truth, and never again let them teach you a half-told story.